Welcome to the Base of Performance live stream. My name is Marshall Henley, and today is S&OP Thursday, where once again we welcome Doug Dedman of DBM Systems. Welcome, Doug.
No, good to be
Welcome,
here,
Doug.
Marshall.
I just shouldn't be doing this anyway.
I blame it on the Christmas turkey, but that's coming up shortly. So
the series we're in is What Does Good Look Like, and this is the last of the. It's actually part 8, but there was a part in there where we talked about the assessment that we had built to measure all these different parts. So when we bring up the graphic here, you'll see that it's actually part 7 measurements, and everything in these 7 parts is targeted at executive engagement. So we've been kind of dealing with executive engagement the entire way. Like that's the purpose of what the other 7 parts are there for, to have a good S&OP process, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So with that said, Doug, why don't we take it away with measurements?
Yeah. So if you just pull up the screen, because I think you've already highlighted that. I probably should have been on the ball here and done this ahead of time. But yeah, there you go. I've just bolded measurements, so we know what we're talking about. Very, very fancy. But going on to your point about executive engagement, right? The things that we keep covering each week that we do this is, how well does your process work? And to check that engagement and to look at this is, a few questions that I always ask. Is the executive S&OP meeting a report out, or is it actually a decision-making meeting, right? You've got the data to support the decision-making. Can you get through the entire business in an hour to an hour and a half? So it's a right level of granularity that you can drive through that. Does everyone walk out of the executive S&OP meeting on the same page, and are they actually ready to execute the plan? And then the final one on that is your senior executive engaged in the meeting. Are they in there? Are they driving the decisions? And so all the things that we've talked about really have to do with what does good look like to get you to the point where you can say yes, 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 and here we go, right?
Yeah.
And so,
yes to these.
Yes to these, absolutely. And so what I wanted to talk today about on the S&OP side of things, on the executive S&OP side, is measurements, right? And really this is the point around, everybody starts one of these projects or looks at improving their S&OP process because they've got a problem, right? They're going, man, I'm dealing with, name it, right? I'm dealing with
inventory.
I'm dealing with past due, right? Inability to meet customer requirements, all of those sort of things. And so ultimately we go, oh, well, implement an S&OP process and boom, we're there. The challenge is that there's kind of different levels of measurement that you look at to say, are we getting better? Are we doing the right things? All of those sort of things. And so I think it's important to just talk about that, is what would those measurements be? And then how do you use those measurements? To me, those are a couple important questions.
Sure.
So I have a graphic that if you bring it up, just to kind of to show this, and it's this idea of kind of building block measurements or metrics, right? And I look at this and say, we want the results, but there's some things we got to do before we get the results. And kind of that first thing is we've got to have a process in place. So we've got to look at, are we doing the right things, right? Do we have the right process? Are we doing the right things? And, until I have that process in place, it's going to be really, really hard for if it's not correct, it's going to be hard for it to get more effective. So we need a measurements of effectiveness. So do we have a process, and are we doing things right? And the effectiveness measurement should basically be showing us some results around that we can see. And then the final one, sorry, and I used the word result before, but I probably shouldn't have, which is, if I'm doing the things right, if I've got the right process in place, and I'm doing things right, then I can get to the results. And those are the things I mentioned usually that are the things that kick off a project at the beginning of it, to say, I'm driving to these KPIs, whether that's reducing my customer lead times, dealing with inventory, but you've really got to work through this continuum. And so what I really want to kind of go through today in the brief time that we're together is looking at each one of those levels and how do we necessarily do that? So process effectiveness and results.
Okay.
Yeah. So if I think about those, and I just got to get, so I'll start with the process, and this is probably a good segue. I know you usually chat about this as we go in, but one of the things is taking a look at your process and saying, am I doing the right things, right? And so this is where an S&OP assessment is great. It's kind of looking at that to say, are the basics in place? Now, with that, it's a snapshot in time. It'll, identify some areas that you should focus on. And ideally, an assessment should give you some sort of idea of a recommended approach. So if you're not sure where to find one, you can get this online at baseperformance.com or at dbmsys.com. Go through this. The report that's kind of pictured here on the screen, I think it's something like 15 pages with a fairly detailed piece of each one of these sections. And this is just really saying, am I doing the right thing? So it's not going to be the be all and end all, but at least gets you started in the, are we, kind of on the right path? And so that's part of measuring the process. The other part that we use, so that's one. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Marshall, at all.
No, I love the assessment. We spent a lot of time building it. That's why it's on both websites. It was a joint venture. DBM's the brain trust for S&OP. I'm not nearly where Doug is, but we do a lot of S&OP work, and so I mean, hundreds of projects. I really don't know anybody that's done more S&OP work than DBM. I don't know of anybody even that's done, individually. I mean, there are companies that have done a ton, but just the Doug himself and Duncan McLeod, the founder of DBM, have really thought leaders in the category, and they know folks like Tom Wallace that interacted with them for years to help them refine their thinking. So I do think that the approach that we talk about in the assessment is really about as good as you can get. And you might score low in a category you thought you did well in, so don't get your feelings hurt. We just have
Yeah.
really, I think, excellent and specific ideas about what you could do to change that.
Yeah. Yeah. And the point of that assessment, like I said, it's free. It's just, it's to, like I said, it's a point in time. It's something that you can look at to say, yeah, where are we at? Where could we, where could we be better? I would actually also encourage you to have multiple people within the organization take it, because
Yes.
a lot of because one of the big things, I mean, this is to overuse the cross-functional, it's a cross-functional process, right? And
Sure.
perception and confidence of the process or in the process, kind of matters as you move through. So
It
that's
does.
kind of out there for people. We use something in addition to that. So if you pull up my screen, we have a detailed assessment that we use, which is a lot more about tracking progress through the implementation, and it's more detailed. And we use this to establish a baseline, and there's actually a lot more. The way it's kind of broken out is there's kind of a major area or question, and then some detail behind there that we look at, and we actually put a target. Is this required as you're going through the implementation? We actually have a target in here where we say, when should we be expecting that in the implementation? And we use some comments in here to say, hey, how are we moving through this? Fairly detailed. And we do this, we review this monthly as we go through. So this is kind of now starting to measure, are you getting the stuff in place that you need to have in place to run a really good process? And so that's another one that we use.
Mhm.
We can do that on a snapshot in time, but I like to use it to say, are we getting the stuff done that we're doing, so that you've got kind of a tangible measurement to that side of it.
Yeah, I always think of that as a transmission. We're not trying to optimize things yet. We're not trying to decide if we're a 1 through 5. We're trying to decide if the gear is in place, because the whole thing isn't going to work unless they all are there.
Right. And this, this is what drives the activities you've got to work on, and that we've got to work on with you if we're working with somebody. And so we use that. The other piece of that process measurement, and this is something you can do, on your own, is using a meeting scorecard. And so I won't go into all the detail on this. There's a really good article up on our website. I think it's up on yours as well, just on this, the idea of a meeting scorecard. And this we've developed over time, and it's real simple to do. We basically have taken sort of three categories that are kind of things that drive success. One is participation in the process. The other one is data, which we just talked about last week, right? And then the third one that's on here is the schedule. In other words, and what by schedule I mean is the process happening when it's supposed to happen. Because schedule to me, and you'll see on here, this says, hey, the process, I can't read my screen real well, but the meeting did happen. This is the meeting happened, but we kind of called an audible in the month and we changed the date of it. And this is it happened when it was scheduled. And green on this one's interesting because it means you've actually got the process embedded into your monthly management process, and it's happening regularly. And that's a pretty important thing because if meetings are getting canceled and moved, that means that always is a question of where does it sit priority for people. And that's the same on the participation. And then the data really says, hey, do we actually have something concrete to measure? And so you can see what those criteria are. We established these, and this is a tool that for those that are working with us, this is something we give you, and then it's you can kind of use it going forward just as a starting point. Make it your own. You can implement a tool like this on your own, just off the bat. But that's one of the things that's super important to say. Is the stuff happening on a regular basis, right? And is it data supported and other people are in there?
And we'll put some links in there to some screenshots so you can reproduce it and use it.
Yeah, and it's like I said, there's actually an article that walks through that. So this is something as a takeaway you can take out of this to say hard to write your own assessment, unless you happen to be an S&OP expert, in which case you're probably not watching this video. Right. But this is something, hey, you can take and kind of work on this on your own and figure that out. So I mean that really covers the idea of measuring the process, that first building block, and then we can now talk about measuring effectiveness. And so. Sorry, Marshall, I should pause there for a second. Sometimes I get rolling, and I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add.
I think we should just remind people that we're measuring process effectiveness and then results, and so we're now going to move into the measurement portion.
Yeah. So thinking about effectiveness, I said are we doing the right things right? It's kind of, are we getting better at what we're doing? And so, the first question on this is, so why do we want to measure effectiveness? Well, this idea of this is, and I talked about tolerance levels. I've talked about that several times, but you're trying to determine what are the control limits of the process, right? So we always want to try to drive to forecast accuracy. Well, how accurate does my forecast need to be? Well, I got to figure out what's kind of the bandwidth within which it happens, right? And the forecast, I mean, we could get a whole discussion about that, which we have in the past, but it's just this idea of kind of the control limits. And so I'll use production as an example, right? Is, once we get this kind of the control limits in place of where we are currently, right? Then we've got to build some strategies based on our current process. So if we can't, say, hey, we're going to produce 1,000 units a month, and we come out and we produce 800. The next month we produce 1,100. If that's where we're at right now, well then, okay, now we've got to figure out, well, how do we handle that variance in there? And so this idea of effectiveness, of upper and a lower limit, is really about establishing that kind of control limits. And anything outside of those will be a red value. So we establish that. And what we do with this is we take the data right from the S&OP sheet, your bookings, shipments, production, and backlog and inventory, and we compare the actuals of the previous month and the call or the forecast to get what the variance is. And and so we do that as a standard measurement, and then we also look at that as an overall effective measurement. So I'm going to show you. There's lots of words on there, but let me just show you kind of an idea. And so you can see here, I've got a chart, right? So my black is actual, and this is, I mean, I know this is a pretty basic looking chart, but it kind of gives you an idea. I've got my actuals, I've got my upper target and my lower target, so the yellow at plus or minus 10%, and I got my upper lower and my upper target and my lower target. This should actually say plus or minus 20%. And what I'm trying to look at is, well, where is my actual demand? Is it coming, 1 month prior? Is it within these horizons? And why is that important? Well, if I can't get within a plus or minus 20%, it means I have to have some buffer to manage the fact that I can't forecast that well. And so, what could that buffer be? Well, that might be a lead time. It might be a buffer from an upside flexibility on my production. It might mean an inventory buffer, right? Like there's a few different things that I can utilize for that. But by establishing those tolerance levels and then kind of measuring to that, I can figure out where should I be setting that. And I typically want to look at that over time to see, are we getting better? Can we get ourselves in tolerance? So you set them, and then you work on your process to get in between them. Then once you're between them, you go, now I want to squeeze these down, right? Because that is where I start to gain my payback, right? In the sense of, especially on the production side and on the inventory side, because once I do that and I've got everything's kind of in control, I can start to shrink the tolerances, and then I start to get some of the payback I'm looking for. Yeah.
I would add, we don't spend a week analyzing the data to get to our initial tolerances either. I mean,
No.
we can probably within a very quick period, an hour of looking at the data, just kind of pick the starting point, because we know we're going to be trying to improve them.
Yeah, I think I've got a slide in a minute that just will say, here's my rule. I don't want to use here's my kind of starting point, and then you figure out from there. So what this looks like typically on this is, you get a chart something like this. So by demand stream, this is, these are the bunch of different demand streams coming into the family, measuring the in and out of tolerance over time, so that I can kind of see. So if you look at it, I've got production here where we none of them have been in tolerance over the last series of months, right? And so that's an area to focus on, and that's a production one. That's saying 1 month out we haven't been able to call within a tolerance, and so that would be a concern. And often we want to focus on demand to start out with. So if you look at, I've got the bookings and shipments. But if you look at this one here, this supply issue is something that's got to be addressed. I look at my EMEA production, same deal. I'm way out of tolerance on that production each month, and so this is really kind of forcing you to that point of what do we do on that? And as a starting piece, we can get real sophisticated. I go plus or minus 20% on bookings, plus or minus 15%. And this, my thought process on this last one has changed a bit over time. Kind of started with a plus or minus 10%. I actually like to set the tolerance level at 0 on the minus and a plus 5 or plus 10. The reason the 0 is so important is, if you miss on production, right, it's impossible, right, to ship everything out that you had, unless you're pulling the stuff out on the inventory side. And you've really got to get to a confidence level that operations can produce at least what they've said that they're going to produce.
Yeah, things happen, but you should be able to produce what you planned on producing. You don't
Yeah.
accidentally produce more most of the time. I mean, it's happened, but
Right.
most of the time that's not
Right. It's kind of like that's the price of admission, right? Is you've got to you got to make that call, and that's actually the confidence one that often you're dealing with in an organization is, as much as we focus on the demand side of things, a lot of organizations right now are sitting with a significant amount of backlog. I mean, this all depends on the season that we're in, but with all the supply chain constraints we've had, all of the issues around staffing, we're sitting here with more backlog than we want, right? And so, you know, the what we book or don't book in a month from a demand standpoint often doesn't impact us a lot in the first month. It impacts us in kind of those future months. And so it's why I always drive it to the point that you should be able to get your confidence level on the production side first.
Yeah.
Not saying that demand's not important and you got to still work on that, but that one is in your control,
And we
right?
say production, but we also mean if you're buying, if it's
Right.
buyouts, I mean, you need a capable supply chain that's going to be able to provide that. And with
Absolutely. Yeah.
supply chain disruption, we all know that that's made it really difficult at times. But the
Yeah.
if you can't get to what you planned on buying or building for the next month, then it's going to be really difficult, to maintain competitive advantage and or
Yeah.
not cede competitive advantage.
And some people will say, well, oh, our lead times are so short that we don't know what we're going to produce. I would actually argue that there's very few businesses that can take an order, buy all the components that they need to do, or set up everything within that 1 month. You might be sitting there looking at buffering yourself with inventory, but the decision to buffer yourself with inventory, right? You have to be looking out further in order to make that decision, which
Right.
really is the production decision you have. That's why it's so important. Often we'll come to a place and they'll have one line, which is the shipment line. They don't worry about the production line. That's why it's so important to have the difference. You need both of those because the
Yeah.
accountability is completely different. So
Yeah, the system
anyway,
needs to be built to match the upper and lower tolerances if necessary.
tolerance levels are really and if you're within tolerance, once you've established that, you don't need to spend a heck of a lot of time in the S&OP meeting. But if you're outside of the tolerance, yeah, I want to know what actually happened, right? We've talked about that several times. So
Yeah.
yeah, so that's kind of the effectiveness measurement. So you establish the tolerance, you measure over time, and you make sure that that's getting better. Which kind of brings us to really the last one, which is measuring the results. And so by results, as I said earlier, these are typically the things that you're looking at, that are that you're driving to improve with an S&OP process. So request date service level, promise date service level, my inventory turns. It might be your fulfillment rates, right? So there's lots of stuff we're looking at on that, and these are the kind of where you're trying to drive to. A couple things about this is you got to clearly define the measurement, right? So what is it that we're measuring? How are we doing that? And you want to do it by family. And I think I have one more point on there. Yes, you want to measure that progress monthly. And so this idea. And why do I want to do it by family? Is because everything at the S&OP presentation and everything in that S&OP process is by family. And so that means the very real actions that you want to take are at the family level. You can't look at this at an aggregate level and do a causal relationship between I did this and this happened. You really want to do this by family because then I can look at it and say, hey, I made this decision, or this is what we did this is what our plan looked like, and here's what we missed on, and now I see what the result is. You've got to look at it by family so it's actionable.
Yes.
So yeah, do
And
your
that's why our
measurement.
families are tied to constraints or things that you can take action on.
Absolutely, right? So it's great to put this big measurement out there. It's kind of like it's great to have a budget at this really, really high level, but the budget is made up of, product families below that. And what you do on those product families is made up on decisions such as how am I marketing that product? How am I, what's the demand look like for that product? What does it take to produce it? All of those sort of things. So it's kind of at that level, that very
Yeah.
actionable level that you're really trying to get to. And yeah, that's why we go to from a capability standpoint, because, ultimately we're balancing demand and supply has some constraints on it, right? So that's why we got to look at it at that level.
It'd probably be great if folks could navigate back to the family design that we did. We did a live stream on family design. We get into the idea of what is constraint based families, what are they for, and I would just remind folks that we have billion-dollar clients that have less than 20 families, sometimes less than 10. So
Yep.
families are not super granular, but they're granular enough that you can actually just decide to to change the production amount that you're going to look for, the inventory amount, whatever you're trying to change in your KPIs, as Doug mentioned.
Yeah, and one of the other big important parts of that is that you will often structure your S&OP with linked families, right? So because
Yeah,
you get into some of these large organizations, I might be, it's an important thing. It's about having at that capability level a good view of, do I actually, is my organization set up to deliver kind of where we want to go? And that's what I should be able to see here. So if we get into now as we continue on the results, and this is a little bit of a, we can kind of talk over this slide a bit, but I thought I would include it because these are some of the things, right, that you would be potentially thinking about, right? Poor service levels, past due back, like these are the pain points that you are often thinking about. Well, if I'm thinking about how do I connect that to the S&OP process, so this, for those that are looking at, well, how do I connect these together? It's really about driving the predictability of demand, predictability of supply, and buffer planning. And those first two, if you think about what we talked about a minute ago, just on these establishing an upper and lower tolerance band and getting better at being within that, that's all about predictability, right? That effectiveness measurement and getting better at the effectiveness measurement is about driving to predictability of what we say we're going to do, right? And then the other piece of that is really that strategic piece, is the buffer planning that we do, because demand and supply aren't always going to be balanced, right? I mean, that's not that, I've got to be figuring out what that, how do I plan those buffers? And that now gets into what am I doing around lead time? We've talked about that multiple times, right? What am I doing around upside flexibility, right? In other words, my capability that I can drive above for a period of time, kind of above my normal capability. What can I do there? And then the one that we all love is inventory, right? That's that, standard buffer that we would think about between demand and supply. And so, I think it's just important to kind of take a macro view of S&OP, right? And just think about that to say, hey, what are we actually doing in S&OP to drive these things? So when we're thinking about the results measurements, you can tie it right to those kind of 3 points there that are really, the ones that you're driving to. So hopefully that's kind of a helpful view on that. I included, this is an old slide, but I included this last one here just as a point here, which really goes back to some work Tom Wallace had done. And it's, to give an idea, people look at the S&OP process, on the hard benefits, and I'm not going to get into the soft side of things, but on time delivery, this was a study that he had done. I think it was like 2009. So it's getting kind of dated. The numbers may be higher, maybe different, but I like to use this just as a standpoint to say, these are some of the areas, the expectation, those ranges are huge, right? Some of these ranges are really big. And so, I always caveat the results to say, yeah, it's there. These are some of the areas you look for. That's why you got to put the measurement to the family level. And that's why you've got to do those other measurements, because you're not going to get these unless I go back and I'm, if I do that effectiveness measurements and I'm not starting to shrink my effectiveness, and I can only shrink my effectiveness if, I start here, and every time we're out of tolerance, I drive to a root cause, and that root cause then changes the way I put my assumptions together,
Yeah.
changes the way I do my planning, and now I'm in tolerance. Now I shrink these down. And when I shrink them down, all of the buffers that I need, right? All those buffers, I can shrink those down, right? Too often, what we do is we're outside the tolerance level, we shrink the buffer down, and we go, well, why the heck aren't we getting results?
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe another way to say it, especially since we do a ton of S&OP consulting, is we get hired in for people who want to, let's say, deal with inventory. So inventory is the pain that's driving them nuts, and they think S&OP is the solution, but they've got to go back and decide that S&OP is going to be a discipline within the organization of planning, and I call it an executive disciplines, because the executive's got to be involved in authorizing it. And once that process is in place, then the effectiveness gets better, and then they can get the results on inventory. And you
Yeah.
can't do it the other way around. You can't, just adopt S&OP and drive inventory on day one.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I'm working with an organization right now that, they had already made the decision to reduce and remove that buffer of finished goods. So they've tied themselves closer to the customer demand, because theoretically their customers giving them EDI that goes out forward, quite a bit. Except the EDI signal is really messy and it's changing all around, and so they're trying to react to this EDI message that's volatile day to day. But the reality is, when you look at it on a little bit more of a macro level, kind of on a monthly level, and it actually isn't that volatile over that time. But because they've gotten rid of that buffer, now I've got to respond. I've got to respond. And then because the signal is not great and it's actually overstated out in the future, they're actually buying components to a volume level that they don't really, that's not where it's going to be. And so they're kind of getting hit in two ways. They got lots of raw material inventory, except for the ones that they're having supply chain issues around. Lots of raw material inventory. And then they're getting hit on this cycling or churning that's happening on the day-to-day basis because they reduced that buffer of finished goods. So what
Yeah.
seemed like a good idea, right? Let's reduce that finished, because man, like finished goods inventory, that's a bad thing. Well, maybe in this case, it's not. And divorcing yourself a bit from that churning signal, those are some things that you'd want to kind of work on. So yeah,
Or maybe another way to say it would be finished goods is something you might get to reducing in the future, but you're not going to do it, by
yeah,
looking 5 inches in front of the car you're driving. And
yeah,
then you have a great article. I think it's still out there about, you grew up on a farm, you actually have a farm, and you learned how to plow, and you were taught to look
yeah.
sufficiently
Got to
far
look
out,
out
but you're not
far in
looking
the
at the
future. Yeah,
horizon,
yeah,
right? You got to
yeah,
look at something that lets you plow a straight line. And I always
yeah,
love that, because I think that is, um, the illusion of flexibility that we talked about. You
yeah.
start driving a car 60 miles an hour, looking, 6 inches in front of your front bumper. If you're I guess if you're in a van or something, but that's not a good way to drive. It's
Right, exactly, exactly.
too
So just
detailed.
just to maybe tie this down, Marshall, just I'll do kind of my final notes on the metrics here. So the first one here on measurements, because sometimes people are a little averse to measuring. We're not measuring to penalize people. So when you think about that process measurement, and we're talking about participation, and we're talking about the meeting, it's not about penalizing the participants who aren't there. It's about shining a light on this so that we can improve the process, right? We're not measuring the tolerance so that we're going to say, hey, you're out of tolerance, that's not good. It's, well, we've got to drive to the root cause of the problem, right? Not
But
meeting them.
I would say it is, so you hold the right people accountable in a
Yeah,
non-punitive way. So the idea is, we've just dealt with a lot of organizations where they're worried about inventory, so then they go over and kind of beat on the operations folks, but it
yeah,
wasn't the operations folks that created the inventory. And once you get that
right.
in view,
Yep.
because sales was out of tolerance or something,
Yeah,
you
and
can
it's
make the right
it's just
decision.
it's an important thing, right? Like, so when I say not to penalize is different than not to hold people accountable. So that's a really good point. You're measuring to hold people accountable, but it's not to beat them over the head with a
Right.
stake, right? It's because a learning organization, right, is one that's using those measurements to improve, right? So that's
Yeah.
a pretty
Love
important
it.
step.
Great point.
Um, You want to educate everyone on the measurements. The number of times I've started working with a company and we say, well, how do you measure your RDSL? How do you measure your PDSL? And there's some crickets, right? Because people don't know. And so, and even though those are fairly, let's call them well-defined measurements, everybody, it's amazing. Everybody looks at them a little bit different, right? And yeah, I get in some great discussions on this, but at the end of the day, you've got to standardize the measurement, and everybody's got to look at it the same way, right? It's just like when we talk about data, right? Everybody's got to be looking at the same data. We can't, it can't be one person looks at it one way, one looks at another. The other one that's important on this is actually like provide visibility to the measurements. So they should be
Yeah.
part of your executive S&OP presentation, especially early on that scorecard. You know, that becomes a little bit of the, okay, guys, like this is where we're missing. Let's get that going, and then celebrate the success. I mean,
Yeah,
goodness, like,
certainly.
sometimes even though we don't want to penalize, sometimes it's like all doom and gloom. Celebrate the success. That's pretty important. So that's kind of what I wanted to cover, Marshall, on the metric side. To me, it's the old saying, you get what you measure.
Right.
It's super important on the S&OP side. So hopefully people have found that to be a little bit more detailed and thinking about it, going back to those three levels.
So I would just remind folks that everything that we've done in the What Does Good Look Like series, which is, the 8 different videos. So there's, what is that? At least 4 or 5 hours of video there. You can quickly take a 10-minute assessment and get a real specific PDF that's going to precisely describe what we think you should do to improve your process and help you prioritize it with a weighted scoring. And that will be available at bezaperformance.com or dbmsys.com. It's kind of what the whole series has been about, is just helping people. I get 1 or 2 ideas that are going to really give them some input into the process getting better, starting with the process, then uh, the I just went blank.
Yeah, I mean, it's looking at
Yep.
the process, and then looking at the effectiveness, and then
Effectiveness. I was
yeah,
I
yeah,
was my brain was going efficiency. I do that a lot. So effectiveness, and then eventually looking at the results. So
yeah,
thanks a
yeah.
bunch, Doug. Good
Yeah,
stuff today.
well, anyways, Marshall, it's always a pleasure to get together and do these, and I guess I can wish you a Merry Christmas as well. So,
Yeah, Merry Christmas. We'll be looking
yeah,
forward
well,
to doing kicking these back off in January. We don't have a specific topic set yet, but be looking for the announcements on LinkedIn and YouTube as to what we're going to be doing in January and beyond.
all
So
right.
have a
Well,
great end
anyways,
of
Mark,
year.
have a good holiday.
You too. Bye bye.
All right, take care. Bye.